friends and enemies. So we're looking at the first civilizations today. Fun times. The first civilizations, you do need to know the locations. Almost all of them are by a river. How fun. Or they're by the coastline. The four primary ones that you've learned about in world history for years are the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, which is between the Tigris and Euphrates River, the Indus Valley Civilization by the Indus River, primarily in modern-day Pakistan, and you have ancient China. We're looking at like the Shang Dynasty, and this is on the Yellow River, sometimes called the Huanghe River. But you also have the Olmec civilization, so in Mesoamerica, and you're getting Norte Chico, something we just call the Andean, like Andes, like the mountain, the Andes civilization here in South America. But it's really along the Andes. You're not getting a lot of really complex civilizations here, like in the rainforest or in the plains area of North America. And in Africa as well, you're not getting as much advanced stuff outside of the Nile and then this little area known as Nubia down here. And Europe's really not doing much during this time period either, nor is Australia and, farming penguins down here in Antarctica. All right, let's move on. So you must know who they are and where they are. Let's look at some shared characteristics of these civilizations. Finally, almost all of them are by rivers. So it's an important characteristic. Now, why is that? It's because rivers flood, and usually these are predictable flooding rivers. They flood, they leave the soil really nutrient filled, and then they plant in this previously flooded area, and then you harvest it before the river floods again. River floods later, brings back nutrients, so on and so forth, and you have some very, very good land to farm in. Sometimes the river would flood unexpectedly, and then everyone would die. That happened too. You also have monumental architecture and urban planning. This is something that we see throughout almost all of these civilizations. Now, if you have monumental architecture, you pretty much, except for some really rare examples, you pretty much have to have civilization. Why? Well, we learned in class that if you have a civilization, that means you have a surplus of food. That means you have division of labor. And now not every person has to be a farmer. If every person doesn't have to be a farmer, some of them get to build stuff like walls or sewage systems. But the most famous examples here are pyramid structures, okay? Famously, you have these ziggurats in Mesopotamia, these kind of large step pyramids. Probably the most famous pyramids are the pyramids at Giza that you have in Egypt. You have these large pyramids. And again, they're just like a much more advanced step pyramid. You have pyramids in Mesoamerica. You have large walls around the city-states in Mesopotamia, especially because they were in an area that was easy to get invaded. And you have some pretty advanced sewer systems as well. The really advanced sewer systems we see come about in the Indus Valley in the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And these are some pretty advanced sewage systems for being so ancient, and that we saw that your waste was all downhill, so that any waste or trash you had would drain out to other water sources, and it would drain downhill. And it was actually more advanced systems than some of medieval Europe was even having, where they had sewers, but the sewers didn't drain, so like it flooded and up comes all the excrement. Fun times. You also get a system of record keeping. Now, I say record keeping because it's not all writing. For the most part, it will become what we think of as a written language. But in Mesopotamia, with the Sumerians, you get something called cuneiform clay tablets, and you use a little stylus to make different shapes here. And cuneiform becomes some of the first language we ever see. The early law codes are written here, like the Code of Hammurabi. We'll see that written in cuneiform. We'll see the earliest written down of the Epic of Gilgamesh is in cuneiform. I think one of the most famous ones we have, just because ancient Egypt is so kind of glorified in history, is hieroglyphics, or also hieroglyphs, and that's where you start to have images represent an idea, and then those end up turning into sounds and words, and you can put them together. When I was a kid, I had a pretty cool hieroglyphic stamp collection where you could actually like make your own hieroglyphs and all that stuff. I knew how to write my name in hieroglyphs. Basically, I was the coolest kid around. And then the weird person here is quipu. Now, quipu is not a form of writing. It is straight up record keeping. Why? Because it was different knotted strings that you see here, and you put different little knots onto cords, and they might be different color and different patterns, and they represented numbers, and so you could record things like the harvests or something with trade. Now, why did record keeping even come about? Well, when you get a more advanced society, you're going to need a way to keep track of who owes what, right? Who's paid their taxes. You need to start having the idea of a contract. I'm going to trade this much for this much of this product for this much of your product, something like that. You need to record, maybe starting to record the histories of the leaders, starting to write down things for religious texts. So you don't need that in a hunter-gatherer society when it's just like 25 people. You don't really need that, okay? So let's look at some of these other forms of record keeping up close. You get in the Shang Dynasty in China, you get these kind of pictograms, and they're done on oracle bones, and then they would done on turtle shells or other bones, and they would then use them to prophesize as well. Here's a better depiction of cuneiform. And then here is quipu. Good times. I know a pretty great dad joke about quipu. Ask me about it later. And here we have what ends up being more of a modern alphabet. Cool. Another really important thing in this time is trade. Specifically, you need to know that trade occurs over some long distances, but it's not a world trade, and it's occurring primarily between 4 areas. First, you have some obviously close areas, Egypt and Nubia, so it's basically from here to here. Okay. And we know this because there are Egyptian goods found in sites in Nubia and vice versa. You also have, not surprisingly, Egypt and Mesopotamia. They're not that far away from each other, so that's not that surprising, especially because it's not like you just exit this Egyptian area and, oh, there's nothing here. Well, we know that there, again, were pastoral nomads. There were some smaller agricultural villages here. They might not be under control over one of these larger states, but they still existed. So people moving back and forth wasn't that uncommon. And we'll talk more about trade in our Bernstein readings. I know you're excited. And Mesopotamia in the Indus River Valley, which is pretty impressive because you actually had to go through some mountains and deserts to get to there. But we have this Mesopotamian seal. We have found it in the Indus River Valley, and so that's really incredible that people were making that long distance of trade continuously enough for us to actually find artifacts from it. And China and Southeast Asia were engaging in trade. A lot of that with ships and boats. And so like modern day Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia engaged in trade with China. The next thing you need to know is that all of these early civilizations had social hierarchies. Now, I've used this very famous and overdone social pyramid, and they have Egypt, and Egypt had pyramids. Haha, it's so great. Anyway, social hierarchies tend to look really, really similar in that you tend to have the unskilled workers at the bottom, especially this would be like your peasant class or your farming classes here. And then you get to your more skilled workers up here, and then you get to the religious class and then the political elite class. And you probably had warriors somewhere here. It's not always the same, but it tends to be on top is kind of the king, the ruler. And then many times the king and the priest class might be one. It might be what's called a theocracy, where religion and law are interwoven. And then you have your priestly class, and you also have your warriors, because your warriors know how to kill people and have armors and shiny weapons, so they win. Then you have your skilled laborers, your artisans, your merchants, your blacksmiths. They're fewer in society and therefore rarer, therefore worth more. And then you have, again, unskilled laborers, okay? It's almost always the same in almost every society. There is patriarchy here, too. Patriarchy. That is where men are in charge. And we know this happens because as women start to have to take care of more of the households and permanent settlements, they start having more children. They can't be as involved in agriculture. They don't have as much physical strength on average as some of the men, and some of the early farming equipment was very difficult to use. It required a great deal of strength. Plus, they're more likely to be raising children or be pregnant. Therefore, they couldn't participate in political life. They couldn't be warriors. They were kept out of political life. Not in every society, but in most societies. And we see that women lose a lot of their power and a lot of their rights. They're no longer producing most of the food as they were in hunter-gatherer societies. I've already touched on this before too, but there's also social stratification. Social stratification is just a fancy way to say that there are different levels of social classes. People who are considered more important and intended to be the more important people were fewer in number, and the less important people were greater in number. But also in reality, the greater in number of people actually do have most of the power if they had a revolt or something like that. But it just tended to be the peasants were kept in place. And they weren't chopping off people's heads, but sometimes they did. We also see in almost all the early civilizations you have slavery. This isn't like slavery we get with the Americas later on. That is a much more brutal and extreme form of slavery. But you do have some sort of slavery, and probably in people from conquered areas, either conquered tribes or other civilizations that went to war with each other. You conquer them and they become an underclass. But almost all legal codes, societies we see, they had slaves. And again, this is all reflected in legal codes, the most famous one being Hammurabi's Code. You see there's different rules for different people. If a man, say, puts out the eye of another man, then he has to lose an eye. This is called an eye for an eye. We see it first in Hammurabi's Code. So if you put out someone's eye, then you have to then lose an eye. But if you put out the eye of a slave, then you just actually have to pay a fine to the slave's master. If a slave puts out someone's eye, well, they're executed. So we see that these legal codes aren't actually fair fully, which is funny because the term eye for an eye is often used to denote fairness, right? You do this, then that happens to you, okay? You do X, X happens to you, right? But actually that wasn't the case. If you're an upper class person, you put out the eye of a slave, it's really nothing. There's also rules it reflected patriarchy, like only certain women were allowed to wear veils if they're an upper class woman. If they weren't an upper class woman, well, then they weren't allowed to wear veils, and they could be punished with death or by being mutilated if they wore veils. So we see this again is reflected in legal code, and in almost all these societies, slavery is perfectly legal. So that is reflected in the legal code as well. Now, when we talk about pastoral nomads and farmers, I told you that pastoral nomads and farmers, they interact with each other heavily. A lot of that interaction is peaceful, but a lot of it is deadly. Because the pastoral nomads tend to have some of the best horses, because lots of times they're raising them, and because they're living a tougher lifestyle and hunting more frequently, they are really great at killing. And two specific groups you need to know about are the Hyksos and the Hittites. Both the Hyksos and the Hittites are going to interact with the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and Egypt for our purposes here. The Hyksos are going to bring about new technology. They're going to bring about better bow and arrow technology and the wheel and chariot. And I told you that pastoral nomads brought about new technology. They diffused new technology. The Hyksos are known for bringing wheeled chariots and for bringing better bow and arrow, and the Hittites are known for bringing iron tools, hence the little joke here. This is a picture from Freemanpedia, a great resource for y'all there, but obviously he's put Iron Man's face on the Hittites because the Hittites brought iron. Cool. But here's the thing. After the Hittites or the Hyksos go and raid or conquer an area with this new technology, before too long, the farmers have that new technology. They adopt it themselves, and they reconquer their own lands. So we see it's an arms race between pastoralists and farmers frequently. The farmers get the upper hand, and the pastoralists get the upper hand. Goes back and forth until the invention of the gun, then the farmers win. And as we're getting a little farther along here, let's talk about religion. So you are going to have three really important religious traditions that will later become the dominant religions of the world that are going to have a huge influence on other religions. So let's talk about each one. First, you get the Vedic religions in India. Now, this isn't full-on Hinduism yet, but you're going to get these texts known as the Vedas, and it comes about because of this group of people called the Indo-Aryans, and they are a group that split off from the other people that founded Europe. So some Aryans, they're lighter skinned in appearance. This is where kind of the concept of the Aryan comes about, though it was not anything at all of what Hitler was thinking, but Hitler was a little wrong on a lot of things, so that shouldn't be surprising. But the Aryans ended up conquering into South Asia and going into present-day Iran and Persia, and with it they brought these ideas that are called the Vedas, and it becomes Hinduism, and also it's going to have a huge impact on another religion called Buddhism. You also get this early tribe of people, the Hebrews, and they are going to become modern Judaism, and modern Judaism is going to be extremely influential on Christianity and Islam, and so this is happening in this time period. The Hebrews were probably, it's arguable with the Zoroastrians, we'll talk about them in a second, but the Hebrews were probably the first monotheistic religion, at least the first widespread monotheistic religion. This is obviously adopted with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And then finally, in present-day Persia, you have Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, we'll talk about more when we talk about the Persian Empire, but this is a religion that has concepts like what we would think of as sin and salvation and ideas of heaven and hell, and it's a dualistic religion, an idea of kind of a good deity, bad deity. We see that also reflected, though, a lot in Judeo-Christian religions with the idea of like Satan and God and all that. And so it's argued, is this a dualistic, a two-part deity religion, or is it a monotheistic religion? You don't have to really take a stand, but you should know that right now that is debated. There are people who say, no, it's a monotheistic religion. No, it's a dualistic religion. Oh, no, there's these kind of nature spirits, so maybe it's even more than that. You just need to know that there's a controversy about it. You don't have to really even take a stand on it. But these three religions are going to be very, very, very important. Very important to later civilizations and later religions. And alright guys, that is pretty much it. If you like this video, go ahead and click right here to like it and subscribe. That's great, guys. And if you go ahead and review this on iTunes and Stitcher, just give me 5 stars and then realize that none of that makes sense because none of that's really applicable here. Okay, guys, I hope you had a great time. Just remember, if you want to do well in the quiz, all you have to do is think about that thing I told you.